There comes a moment when you stop trying to explain yourself because you are exhausted from watching people misunderstand everything about you. You sit quietly in a room full of conversations, yet somehow you feel like you are standing outside of your own life. Everyone else seems to know exactly where they belong. They laugh at the same jokes, chase the same goals, celebrate the same victories, and move together, as though they were following an invisible path that was designed specifically for them. Then you look at yourself and wonder why every time you try to walk in that same direction, something inside you refuses to cooperate. You have forced yourself to fit in. You have smiled when your heart was heavy. You have agreed with people even when your spirit felt disturbed. You have followed opportunities that everyone else admired, only to discover that they left your soul emptier than before. You have wondered if something was wrong with you, because the places where everyone else seemed comfortable made you restless. Perhaps you even prayed in silence, asking God why your life never seemed to move in the same rhythm as everyone around you. Why does it feel like every road that seems open for others somehow closes when you approach it? Why do relationships that appear effortless for everyone else become complicated for you? Why does your heart keep pulling you away from places that everyone insists are exactly where you should stay? You may have spent years believing this tension was your greatest weakness, but what if it has been pointing towards something you have not yet understood? What if the very discomfort that makes you question yourself is not evidence that you are broken, but evidence that your life cannot be built the same way as everyone else's? That possibility is frightening, because it means you cannot measure your journey against the people around you. It means that while the crowd is running in one direction, you may be asked to stand still. While everyone is celebrating immediate success, you may be learning quiet obedience. While others are building lives that make perfect sense from the outside, God may be doing something invisible inside you that cannot yet be explained. That season is lonely because nobody applauds invisible work. Nobody congratulates hidden growth. Nobody notices the battles that happen inside a heart that wants to trust God, while everything around it says to simply follow what everyone else is doing. Maybe that is exactly where you are today. Maybe you have grown tired of asking yourself why you always feel different, why conversations leave you feeling disconnected, why success sometimes feels strangely empty, why your deepest desires seem impossible to explain to the people closest to you. You may even feel guilty for not being satisfied with a life that others would gladly accept. Yet every time you try to silence that feeling, it returns. It keeps whispering that there has to be more than simply blending into the crowd. There has to be more than living according to everyone else's expectations. Deep inside, your soul refuses to settle for imitation because it was created for transformation. That realization does not arrive all at once. Instead, it begins with quiet disappointments, the promotion that looked perfect but left your heart unsettled, the friendships that required you to hide who you really were, the seasons when saying yes to everyone else meant saying no to the person God was slowly shaping you to become. Those moments are painful because they force you to confront a difficult truth. Sometimes the greatest danger is not failure. Sometimes the greatest danger is succeeding at becoming someone you were never meant to be. Many people spend their entire lives following the crowd because the crowd offers something that feels safe. If everyone is moving in the same direction, then choosing that path seems less risky. If everyone approves of a decision, then it feels easier to believe it must be right. Yet throughout Scripture, God's work so often begins by separating someone from what feels familiar, not to punish them, but to prepare them. The separation is uncomfortable because it interrupts every expectation. It asks a person to trust before understanding. It asks them to keep walking even when they cannot see where the road leads. That kind of faith does not grow inside noisy crowds. It grows in quiet places where the only voice left to hear is God's. Perhaps that explains why your life has contained seasons when everything familiar seemed to fall away. Friends changed. Opportunities disappeared. Plans collapsed. Doors closed without explanation. At the time, it felt like loss. It felt like rejection. It felt as though life itself was moving on without you. But now, consider another possibility. What if those closed doors were protecting you from building your identity around the approval of people who were never meant to define your future? What if your loneliness was creating room for a deeper dependence on God, instead of constant dependence on human validation. That does not make the pain disappear. It does not erase the tears you cried when nobody understood your heart. It does not erase the nights when you questioned whether God had forgotten you. Yet pain often changes meaning once purpose begins to appear. The wound remains part of your story, but it no longer controls the ending. If these words describe something you have been carrying, leave a comment saying, "I understand." Sometimes simply realizing that someone else has walked through this same valley reminds us that we are not as alone as we imagined. There is another struggle that few people ever talk about. It is the quiet pressure to become someone else just so life feels easier. Maybe you have watched people around you compromise their values because it earned acceptance. Maybe you have seen honesty exchanged for popularity, conviction exchanged for convenience, and integrity exchanged for temporary success. Part of you wondered whether you should do the same. After all, would life not be simpler if you stopped resisting? Would it not be easier if you laughed at what everyone else laughed at, believed what everyone else believed, wanted what everyone else wanted? Yet every time you tried, something inside you refused to stay silent. It was not pride, it was not stubbornness, it was the growing awareness that peace cannot be found by abandoning the person God is shaping. The crowd often promises belonging, but belonging that requires you to lose your true self always comes with a hidden cost. You may gain approval while quietly losing your peace. You may receive applause while feeling increasingly disconnected from your own soul. You may finally fit in while wondering why your joy keeps disappearing. God does not call people toward that kind of life. His work is never centered on helping you become a better copy of everyone else. Instead, He patiently transforms your heart until you become the person He created before anyone else's expectations ever touched your life. That transformation usually feels slower than we want. It often feels hidden. Sometimes it even feels like nothing is happening at all. But roots grow underground long before branches reach toward the sky. Character develops quietly before purpose becomes visible. Trust deepens long before circumstances begin to change. That is why your waiting is not wasted. Every unanswered prayer has taught you something about perseverance. Every disappointment has revealed something about what truly matters. Every lonely season has exposed the difference between temporary comfort and lasting peace. There are moments when you look back and realize that the paths you desperately wanted to follow would have slowly turned you into someone you no longer recognize. Looking back, you begin to understand why God did not allow everything you asked for to happen exactly as you imagined. His answers were sometimes silence, sometimes delay, sometimes redirection. Yet through each season, His faithfulness remained even when His purposes remained hidden. Right now, you may still feel caught between two worlds. One world keeps telling you to follow the crowd because it appears easier, faster, and more rewarding. The other quietly invites you to trust God even when His direction feels uncertain. That tension is exhausting because certainty seems so much easier than faith, but faith has never required complete understanding before taking the next step. It only asks for enough trust to keep walking, even when tomorrow remains unseen. Perhaps the deepest struggle is not that you have been different. Perhaps it is that you have spent so much energy wishing you were not. What would happen if you stopped treating your uniqueness as something that needed to be fixed? What if the sensitivity that others misunderstood became the compassion through which God comforts people? What if the questions that made you feel isolated became the doorway to deeper wisdom? What if the seasons when you walked alone were not signs that God had abandoned you, but opportunities for Him to teach you to recognize His voice above every other voice competing for your attention? Those questions do not erase the difficulty of today, but they begin changing the way you carry it. Instead of asking why your journey looks different, you slowly begin asking what God may be forming within you through this difference. That question opens a completely different kind of hope, because it shifts your focus away from comparison and toward transformation. Comparison always leaves the soul empty, because someone else will always appear further ahead. Transformation fills the soul, because every small step becomes evidence that God is still working, even when the destination remains hidden. Before this part of your journey ends, consider remembering one simple truth. Every crowd has a direction, but not every direction leads where God is calling you. Sometimes love requires Him to gently lead you away from the voices that are loudest, so you can finally hear the one who has been speaking softly all along. And when that happens, you may discover that the loneliness you feared was never meant to destroy your faith. It was quietly teaching you to recognize the shepherd, even when the rest of the world kept walking another way. There is a particular kind of exhaustion that comes from constantly wondering if you are the one who is wrong. It is not the exhaustion of working long hours or carrying too many responsibilities. It is the exhaustion of questioning your own heart every single day. You begin to distrust your instincts because they rarely agree with the people around you. When everyone celebrates a decision that leaves you uneasy, you assume your feelings must be mistaken. When everyone encourages you to pursue what appears successful, yet something inside you quietly resists, you start believing your hesitation is weakness instead of discernment. This battle becomes even heavier when it involves people you love. Family members may sincerely want what they believe is best for you. Friends may encourage you with genuine affection. Mentors may offer advice based on their own experiences. None of them are necessarily wrong, and yet their direction may not be the direction God is shaping for your life. That realization is one of the most painful lessons a believer can face, because it forces you to understand that love and understanding are not always the same thing. Someone can love you deeply and still misunderstand the road God is inviting you to walk. That misunderstanding often creates silent loneliness. You stop trying to explain yourself, because every explanation seems to create more confusion. You smile during family gatherings, while secretly wondering why you feel like a stranger in places that are supposed to feel like home. You celebrate other people's accomplishments while quietly asking God why your own life feels delayed. You scroll through pictures of people reaching milestones, finding relationships, advancing careers, buying homes and accomplishing dreams, while your own journey seems hidden behind unanswered prayers and unfinished chapters. Little by little, comparison begins whispering dangerous lies. It tells you that you have fallen behind. It tells you that everyone else has figured life out except you. It tells you that your slower journey must mean God is less interested in your story. Those whispers become louder during quiet nights, when there is nothing to distract your thoughts. You replay old conversations. You revisit old disappointments. You remember opportunities that disappeared without explanation. You wonder whether one different decision could have changed everything. You carry regret over choices that now seem obvious, even though they were impossible to see clearly at the time. The enemy of your peace often works through hindsight, convincing you that every past mistake permanently disqualified you from God's purpose. But Scripture consistently reveals something very different about the character of God. Again and again, He meets people whose lives appear complicated, delayed, or even broken. Their stories are rarely neat. Their paths are rarely direct. Many of them spend years in seasons that make no sense until much later. Think about how often God develops people in obscurity before placing them in positions of influence. There is something deeply humbling about hidden seasons because they remove nearly every external measure of success. During those years, your faith cannot survive on applause because there is very little applause to receive. Your confidence cannot depend upon recognition because almost nobody notices your growth. Your identity cannot rest on achievement because many of your greatest victories happen entirely within your own heart. The person who forgives, instead of becoming bitter, experiences a miracle that the world cannot measure. The person who chooses integrity when compromise would be easier wins a battle invisible to everyone else. The person who continues praying after months or years without obvious answers demonstrates a strength that cannot be captured by titles or accomplishments. Heaven notices victories that the world overlooks. Perhaps that is one reason why following God often feels so different from following the crowd. The crowd naturally celebrates visible success. God patiently cultivates invisible character. The crowd asks how quickly you arrived. God asks who you became while you were traveling. The crowd rewards appearance. God transforms the heart. The crowd encourages constant comparison. God invites quiet faithfulness. Those two directions rarely feel compatible, and trying to satisfy both usually leaves you emotionally divided. Maybe you have experienced that division. One part of you longs to trust God's timing, while another part grows tired of waiting. One part of you wants to remain faithful, while another part wonders whether compromise would finally make life easier. One part of you believes your life has purpose, while another part fears you have misunderstood everything. These internal battles can make you feel spiritually weak, but often they reveal that your faith is still alive. People who no longer care rarely wrestle with obedience. The struggle itself often reflects a heart that genuinely desires to honor God, even while wrestling with fear, uncertainty, and disappointment. Sometimes we imagine that mature faith eliminates every question. In reality, mature faith often continues walking while questions remain unanswered. It learns that trust is not the absence of uncertainty, but the decision to keep placing uncertainty into God's hands. That lesson is not learned in comfortable seasons. It is learned when nothing around you seems to support hope. It is learned when you pray and heaven feels silent. It is learned when your circumstances tempt you to believe that God has forgotten your name. During those moments, something remarkable begins happening beneath the surface. The version of faith that depended on favorable circumstances slowly dies, and a deeper faith begins growing in its place. This new faith no longer says, "I trust God," because everything is working out exactly as I expected. Instead, it quietly says, "I trust God because His character remains faithful, even when my understanding remains incomplete." That kind of trust cannot be manufactured overnight. It develops one difficult day at a time, one unanswered prayer at a time, one act of obedience at a time. Looking back, you may realize that some of your greatest spiritual growth happened during seasons you would never choose to repeat. The heartbreak you begged God to remove eventually taught you compassion for people carrying similar pain. The rejection that once shattered your confidence eventually freed you from living for human approval. The delay that frustrated you eventually protected you from stepping into situations your heart was not yet prepared to handle. None of those experiences felt like gifts while you were living through them. They felt confusing. They felt unfair. They felt lonely. Yet time slowly revealed that God was not absent from those moments. He was quietly working through them in ways your limited perspective could not yet recognize. If this message is reminding you of a season God has already carried you through, share your experience in the comments. Someone reading your words may discover hope simply by realizing they are not the only person who has walked through this valley. One of the most beautiful transformations God accomplishes is changing the questions we ask. At first we ask, "Why is this happening to me?" Later we begin asking, "What can God produce in me through this?" That change does not happen because pain becomes enjoyable. It happens because faith begins seeing beyond immediate circumstances. Suddenly, every delay no longer appears meaningless. Every disappointment no longer appears permanent. Every closed door no longer feels like the end of the story. Instead, life becomes an invitation to trust the author, who can see the entire chapter while we are still reading a single page. Perhaps that is why you have never been completely comfortable following the crowd. The crowd can only see what is visible today. God is preparing people for realities they cannot yet imagine. The crowd chooses what appears impressive in the moment. God often chooses what develops humility, patience, endurance, and compassion over time. If He is leading you differently, it is not because He enjoys making your journey difficult. It is because your formation matters more than your immediate comfort. One day you may discover that the very path you once resisted became the road that allowed you to know God more deeply than you ever thought possible. Until then, your invitation is not to understand everything. Your invitation is simply to remain faithful with today's step, trusting that the God who began His work in your life has not stopped shaping you, even in seasons when His hands seem hidden. One day you will notice something that once seemed impossible. The questions that used to consume your mind every morning will no longer carry the same weight. Not because every mystery has been solved, and not because every prayer has already received the answer you hoped for, but because something inside you has changed. You begin to realize that peace was never supposed to come from finally understanding every detail of your future. It comes from slowly discovering that God's presence has been quietly sustaining you through every chapter you thought would break you. Looking back, You start recognizing moments that once felt meaningless, the conversations that ended unexpectedly, the friendships that slowly disappeared, the opportunities that slipped away despite your best efforts, the dreams that remained delayed long after you believed they should have become reality. For years, those memories felt like evidence that life had somehow gone wrong. They looked like failures scattered across your story. Yet now, with different eyes, you begin noticing another pattern hidden beneath the surface. Every loss forced you to loosen your grip on something temporary. Every disappointment exposed another place where your identity had become attached to something that could never truly satisfy your soul. Every delay quietly redirected your heart toward a dependence on God that could never have developed while everything was working exactly as you planned. This realization does not erase your grief. It does not pretend that painful seasons were enjoyable. God never asks you to celebrate suffering for its own sake, but He does invite you to believe that suffering is not powerful enough to cancel His purpose. That is an entirely different perspective. It means your hardest seasons no longer become proof that God abandoned you. Instead, they become places where His faithfulness can eventually be recognized in ways that comfort never could have revealed. There is something extraordinary about a person who has learned to trust God after experiencing disappointment. Their confidence no longer depends upon circumstances. Their joy is quieter but deeper. Their hope is less dramatic but far more resilient. They no longer need life to unfold perfectly in order to believe that God remains good. That kind of faith cannot be borrowed from someone else's testimony. It is born through personal encounters with God's faithfulness inside seasons that nobody else completely understands. Perhaps that explains why so many people who have walked closely with God speak less about spectacular moments and more about ordinary days. They remember the morning when they found enough strength to keep going after believing they had nothing left. They remember the unexpected peace that arrived during anxious nights. They remember the quiet reassurance that came while reading Scripture after weeks of emotional exhaustion. They remember prayers that seemed unanswered until years later, when they finally recognized that God had been answering them in a completely different way. Those moments rarely become headlines, but they often become the foundation of a lifetime of faith. You may be waiting for one dramatic breakthrough, while God is patiently building countless smaller ones inside your heart. Every time you choose forgiveness instead of resentment, something changes. Every time you resist the temptation to compare your journey with someone else's, something changes. Every time you continue trusting God's character despite not understanding His timing, something changes. Transformation is rarely announced with loud celebrations. More often it happens quietly, almost unnoticed, until one day you realize you have become someone who responds differently than you once did. Situations that used to fill you with panic now drive you toward prayer. Rejection that once destroyed your confidence now reminds you that your value was never determined by human approval. Waiting that once felt unbearable now becomes an opportunity to deepen your trust instead of feeding your fear. You begin discovering that God has not merely been changing your circumstances, He has been changing you. That is why following the crowd could never satisfy the deepest longing of your soul. The crowd teaches you to chase whatever appears successful today. God patiently teaches you to become the kind of person who remains faithful regardless of what today looks like. The crowd measures life through comparison. God measures life through transformation. The crowd constantly asks, "What do other people think about me?" God gently asks, "Who are you becoming in my presence?" Those are completely different questions, and they produce completely different lives. Imagine what would have happened if every uncomfortable season had immediately ended the moment you asked God to remove it. Perhaps you would have escaped some pain, but perhaps you also would have missed the very lessons that now allow you to encourage someone else. The compassion you carry today may have been born from heartbreak. The wisdom you possess may have grown from mistakes you once wished you could erase. The patience you demonstrate may have developed during years when nothing seemed to move according to your plans. God has a remarkable way of redeeming experiences that once appeared completely wasted. Even your scars begin serving a purpose. They remind you of where God carried you. They become evidence that pain was present, but it did not have the final word. There may still be days when loneliness returns. There may still be moments when comparison quietly knocks at the door of your mind. There may still be seasons when waiting feels longer than you believe you can endure. Faith does not eliminate every struggle, but it changes how you walk through them. Instead of facing those moments believing you have been abandoned, you begin facing them knowing that God has remained faithful before, and He will remain faithful again. That memory becomes an anchor. It steadies your heart when emotions become unpredictable. It reminds you that the God who sustained you yesterday has not suddenly changed today. Perhaps someone listening to these words has been carrying a secret burden for a very long time. You have smiled for other people while quietly grieving inside. You have encouraged others while wondering whether anyone truly sees your own battles. You have continued showing up, even when your heart felt tired. If that is your story, know this: God has never measured your life only by what other people can see. He has seen every silent prayer you never spoke aloud. He has seen every tear you wiped away before anyone noticed. He has seen every act of faithfulness that received no applause. None of it has been invisible to Him. That truth matters because living for God often means accepting that the greatest parts of your journey will remain unseen by the world. But being unseen by people is not the same as being forgotten by God. In fact, some of His most important work happens precisely where no audience exists. The roots of a tree grow in darkness long before anyone admires its branches. Likewise, the deepest parts of your spiritual life are often developed away from recognition, away from popularity, and away from the pressure to impress others. If your life has felt hidden, perhaps it is because hidden places have always been fertile ground for God's work. Before you leave this message, take a moment to think about where you were 1 year ago. Remember the fears you carried. Remember the questions that kept you awake. Remember the struggles you thought would never end. Then look at where you are today. Even if your circumstances are still imperfect, you are not the same person. You have survived days you once believed would destroy you. You have learned truths that only difficult seasons could teach. You have witnessed God's faithfulness in ways your past self could never have imagined. Do not overlook that growth, simply because your destination has not fully arrived. God is not only interested in where He is leading you, He also cares deeply about who you become along the way. If this message has reminded you that your journey still has purpose, share your testimony below. Someone else may be standing exactly where you once stood, desperately needing the hope that your story can provide. And as you continue forward, remember this whenever you feel the temptation to measure your life by the direction of the crowd. The crowd cannot define your calling because the crowd did not create your heart. The crowd cannot determine your purpose because the crowd cannot see what God is forming inside you. The crowd may misunderstand your waiting, question your decisions, or fail to recognize the quiet work taking place within your soul. But God sees every step. He sees the courage it takes to remain faithful when compromise would be easier. He sees the perseverance required to keep believing when visible evidence seems scarce. He sees the longing in your heart to honor Him even when you still have unanswered questions. And perhaps that is the greatest freedom of all. You were never created to spend your life chasing acceptance from people who cannot fully understand the story God is writing. You were created to walk with the One who knows every chapter before it unfolds, who remains present in every valley, who patiently shapes every season, and who never wastes the life of someone willing to trust Him one faithful step at a time.